cow's milk injected directly into people's veins, naughty monkey bits grafted onto humans, malaria deliberately given to fry the brain with fever, and more. These are disturbing medical practices that were banned. Before doctors figured out safe blood transfusions, they tried pumping cow's milk into people's veins. Not making that up, and it happened not that long ago in the grand scheme of things. Hospitals in the US and Europe were doing this between the 1850s and 1910s. They figured milk nourishes the body when you drink it, so why not inject it straight into the bloodstream? They thought the proteins in milk could substitute for blood proteins, and the fats could provide energy and nutrition directly to tissues. So, say you had a sick or anemic person who couldn't eat properly, well, they could get essentially fed through their veins instead. And yeah, this went badly. The fat molecules in milk are way too big for human blood vessels. Patients had fevers, chest pain, they formed clots, some died within hours, others survived the initial infusion but ended up with severe inflammation or embolisms that killed them later. There were medical conferences dedicated to perfecting milk transfusion techniques. Doctors published case studies comparing different milk preparations. They genuinely thought that they were onto something here. Sergei Voronov ran a monkey farm in France. Not for conservation or research in the modern sense, he needed a steady supply of monkey bits to graft into wealthy men. And yes, I mean those bits. This was the 1920s and 30s, and Voronov was convinced that transplanting animal tissue into humans could reverse aging, restore vitality, and sharpen mental function. Perform these surgeries in private clinics on patients who paid some hefty sums of money. The procedure involved taking slices of tissue from monkey nards and surgically attaching them to human patients. Voronov claimed success after success, and for a while he was treated as a legitimate genius. Other surgeons tried similar experiments with different animal organs, thyroid glands, adrenal tissue, etc. The results ranged from nothing happening to serious infections. The rejuvenation that patients were promised, it didn't happen. Odd thing about this one is that it wasn't shut down by any single law or ban in most places. The project just kind of faded as doctors realized that it didn't work. But for years this was considered cutting-edge medicine. Did you know that a man named Julius Wagner Jauregg won a Nobel Prize for deliberately infecting people with malaria? Not joking. The Austrian psychiatrist introduced this treatment around 1917 for patients with late-stage syphilis that had infected their brains. Neurosyphilis was a death sentence back then. Antibiotics didn't exist yet, so the only thing to do, of course, was fight one deadly disease with another. Patients were injected with the malaria parasite, and doctors waited while their temperatures shot up. The high fevers would supposedly kill the syphilis bacteria, or at least slow down the brain damage. Once the patient survived enough fever cycles, doctors would treat the malaria and hope for the best. Sometimes patients improved, sometimes they died from the malaria, and sometimes they had seizures or suffered permanent damage from having, two serious infections at once. Mortality rates hit 15% in some reports. Hospitals across Europe and the United States used Malariotherapy as standard treatment for years. Patients often didn't fully understand what was happening or had no other options. If the first malaria infection didn't work, doctors would infect them again and again. The treatment continued into the 40s and early 50s, right up until penicillin became a thing. Once doctors had an antibiotic that could actually cure syphilis without bringing malaria into the mix, Malariotherapy disappeared almost overnight. But for decades, patients endured this approach because it was really the only option doctors had. In Ireland between 1944 and 1987, around 1,500 women had their pelvises cut open while giving birth. Not a C-section, this was called Symphysiotomy. Doctors would operate at the front of the pelvis to force the birth canal wider. The procedure was faster and cheaper than a C-section, but it came at a cost. Many women weren't told what was being done to them. First of all, they'd be in labor, something would go wrong, and the next thing they knew, surgeons were sawing through their pelvis. The cuts would be several centimeters long. Recovery took months, and some women never fully recovered. Chronic pain, permanent difficulty walking was common. Part of why this continued for so long, though, in Ireland specifically, had to do with the Catholic Church's influence on medical care. C-sections could get women labeled for sterilization, or told they couldn't have more kids, which the church didn't like, so hospitals leaned on this procedure instead. Doctors in the 18th and early 19th centuries had a solution for drowning victims. Blow tobacco up their rectum. correct them. Yes, this actually happened. It was considered standard medical practice across Europe and North America. The Royal Humane Society in London and other rescue organizations kept tobacco smoke enema kits stationed along the riverbanks and ports for emergencies. The theory was that the smoke would, warm the body from the inside, stimulate circulation, revive someone who'd collapsed or stopped breathing. Medical professionals genuinely believed this worked. They used it for near-drowning cases, shock, unconsciousness, also for conditions like hernias, cholera, and severe headaches. A tube connected to bellows would be inserted and tobacco smoke would be pumped directly into the patient's body while they just lay there unresponsive. There was really no understanding of oxygenation or how breathing actually worked. No one knew the correct dosage or duration. Some patients were lucky enough to just get burns. Others were poisoned by nicotine absorption, and all for nothing because the procedure was useless. It lasted into the early 1800s before finally being abandoned. Another fun fact, sorta, is that the phrase blowing smoke up your ASS supposedly originates from this. Makes sense to me, but there's some debate on that. Bloodletting killed people for centuries, but doctors kept doing it anyway. Practice was based on the theory of the four humors, the belief that illness came from imbalances in bodily fluids. The solution was to remove blood until balance was restored. Leeches were most famously used for this, but they'd also use other tools. Doctors would drain patients for fevers, infections, headaches, digestive problems, all sorts of things. The amounts removed were often massive. Patients would be drained repeatedly over days or weeks, sometimes to the point of fainting. Many just died right there. And this practice went on into the 19th century. Next up we have the water cure, which doesn't sound so bad compared to the other stuff we've covered so far, but hydrotherapy in psychiatric hospitals was not a gentle spa day. In psychiatric hospitals back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, it meant being strapped down, shoved into freezing or boiling water, and left there for hours, supposedly to shock the nervous system into being more obedient. One method involved repeatedly dunking patients into freezing water until they stopped resisting. Sometimes they'd also wrap patients tightly in wet sheets and leave them to dry while restrained, sometimes overnight. I mean, it sounds like medieval torment. Some facilities alternated between ice water and near boiling water, believing that temperature swings would reset emotional problems. It made patients more quiet and compliant, but was it actually helping them? Of course not. I mean, they were basically being almost waterboarded. There were deaths, lots of them, from shock, pneumonia, hypothermia, but sometimes patients would shut up, so it was worth it, right? Medical boards started condemning the practice by the mid-20th century, and it gradually disappeared from psychiatric care. Modern hydrotherapy, the kind you find at spas today, obviously has nothing to do with this. Over 60,000 people were forcibly sterilized in the United States between the 20s and 70s under state laws designed to prevent supposedly unfit people from reproducing. This was a mainstream medical practice. California led the US in these procedures, and Germany later studied California's program when developing their own racial policies in the 30s. Targets were people with disabilities, mental illnesses, criminal records. Indigenous women and poor women were sterilized at a disproportionate rate too. Courts ordered some sterilizations, social workers recommended others. A lot of victims would be told they were having routine surgeries and then only discovered years later they'd actually been sterilized. So yeah, this was forced. The eugenics movement grew from a pseudo-scientific belief that society would be improved by controlling reproduction, and it continued in various forms through the 70s, only stopping after survivors went public and lawsuits exposed what had been happening. Sweden ran similar programs and issued an apology in the late 90s. North Carolina eventually offered compensation to survivors decades after the fact, but the scope of forced sterilization programs went far beyond those examples. Canada, parts of Japan, other countries also ran their own versions. Between the 30s and 60s, psychiatric hospitals would inject patients with massive insulin doses to force them into days-long comas. Why the hell would they do that? Well, the theory was that this would reset brain function and improve symptoms of schizophrenia. Of course, though, this was incredibly dangerous. Patients were strapped to beds as their blood sugar crashed to dangerous levels. Doctors monitored them closely, watching for seizures, brain damage, or death. Side effects were common: prolonged confusion, transfusion, permanent brain damage, and people would die at rates as high as 5% per treatment. And doctors would have to repeat the comas multiple times per patient, hoping eventually something would improve. The treatment spread across Europe and North America, particularly in overcrowded psychiatric hospitals. There was no evidence this actually worked, but hospitals kept doing it because they had no other options. Once antipsychotic medications became available in the 60s, insulin coma therapy disappeared almost immediately. And finally, we have frontal lobotomies. Antonio Egas Moniz started in Portugal in 1935 by injecting alcohol into patients' frontal lobes to destroy brain tissue. The idea was that severing certain connections could calm severe mental illness. Sometimes it left patients as these blank zombies, unable to function, or would just kill them. Walter Freeman took it further in the United States. In the 40s, he developed the transorbital lobotomy, the ice pick method. Instead of drilling into the skull, Freeman would insert a thin instrument under the eyelid, drive it through the eye socket with a hammer, and sever those connections in the frontal lobes. He could do multiple procedures in a day. He traveled around the country performing lobotomies in hospitals that were overwhelmed with psychiatric patients and just desperate for any quick solution. Tens of thousands of people were lobotomized in the US alone. Women made up more than 70% of patients in some places. If you were lucky enough to survive, you'd have no improvement, but you would have irreversible brain damage on top of your original condition. Freeman continued performing lobotomies into the 60s, even after the medical world had mostly rejected the practice. Last patient died from a brain hemorrhage caused by the procedure. Well, I've been your host, James. I'll catch you, yes, you specifically, in the next video.